What is up, Internet? This is Scott from the Crescive method. Today we're going to do another soil balancing masterclass talking about good old moms and prop. I was putting some stuff together for the next masterclass, which is coming up November 3rd. We'll be meeting once a week, roughly, for about 8 weeks, navigating around the holidays. If you're interested in the soil balancing class, you can go to our website, crescivesoil.org. Click on the Learn tab and go to the Master Classes. I'll put the link in the description. You just go here and click Apply to the Soil Balancing class, and you can get on with your education. So, without further ado, I guess we'll welcome some of the homies that are joining in the chat. And, I had some things on my mind about dealing with mother stock and propagation material, specifically in the cannabis space, but that's mostly just because we spend most of our time in the cannabis space. And it's the same principles wherever you might be working. So if you're working in, cucumber starts, it's the same concept and the same obstacles and the same opportunities. So I guess we'll just kind of jump in to it. I kind of made a little keynote. Last week we were scribbling a la John Madden, but I figured this one would be a little bit easier to kind of execute with some little drawings. So let's just imagine for a minute that we are managing 4 pots of mother stock. And this could be 4,000 pots, this could be 2 pots, it doesn't matter, but the concepts are the same and the obstacles are at every single farm we're at. And when Sarah and I have worked in these large commercial farms, the biggest stick and the biggest obstacle seems to be in the moms and propagation and scaling to have enough and have healthy enough clones in order to meet the new plant count accepted limits, I guess you could say. So Sarah and I have spent a tremendous amount of time in mother stock, nursery spots, and everything you can imagine. And the same principles happen everywhere. So let's imagine just for a minute that we have 4 pots and we fill them with soil. And we really lucked out on this situation because we got soil that was very consistent. That's not typical, but we'll just say for the sake of this demonstration that the soil that we have in all these pots is equally the same from a mineral chemistry standpoint. We'll say it's even balanced. So we take 4 plants and we put them into these pots. It's really common that people with cannabis especially will put different genetics to maintain the mother stock so that we can have clones of different varieties. So let's say we put a plant up here that's a little bit hungry. These 2 plants might be less hungry, and then we've got a real light feeder in this one. And so you go several months down the road and you can see that, metaphorically speaking, the nutrition in this soil that started out consistent is being depleted at an uneven rate. And this happens pretty much everywhere. It's also pretty common, especially in the cannabis space, that we replace the same genetics into the same pot. And this is one of the biggest problems, to be honest. So there's a concept of crop rotation, which is really important in certain situations. Usually it's mentioned in context of disease control and not having the same plant over and over and over again in order to avert some sort of root pathogens. And I guess that's fairly true, but I think it's far more important from a mineral chemistry standpoint. And there's been certain situations where we've worked with farms that will flower the same variety in bed 1, a different variety in bed 2, a new variety in number 3, and so on. So they have 4 beds that consistently get the same genetic in a certain bed. And when we start to analyze the soil chemistry of those 4 beds, you will see a similar pattern to this. So, maybe the taller version is going to draw down a little bit harder on calcium. Maybe these 2 are a little bit more magnesium hungry, and you got some light feeding CBD genetic or something like that. And so there's at least the importance of crop rotation from a concept of most plants, and even within the same family of plants like cannabis, are going to consume various elements at different rates from that soil. And one of the first things that you need to manage is that concept itself, and it gets the hardest in the mom zone. For one reason it gets the hardest in the mom zone is because most of the time we're in pots. So managing the variation in pots is very difficult. So we've got our genetics here. We've ran several months. We've taken a round of clones, and these pots have drawn down on this soil at different rates. We go a few months more down the road with the same genetics, or maybe we've harvested these mother stock and we've replanted with the same exact plants and the same exact pots. That's really common as well. You know, we cut down an OG, we replace it with an OG. Makes sense. But you're consistently depleting that soil in a much different fashion than its little neighbors. And so at this point, we've depleted this soil to such a degree, we're starting to see very clear visual deficiency in this plant. It's maybe not growing true to type. In cannabis, maybe it's throwing 2 or 3 spear leaves. That will then prompt us to pull a soil sample, if at all, really. Most farmers don't end up doing a soil analysis to try and sort some of this stuff out. And so let's say that we did do a soil analysis, but we homogenized all 4 of these pots. And when we homogenize a sample, it then becomes some sort of like averaged, diluted, muddied version of what's there. And this is kind of an exaggerated example to clarify a point, I guess you could say, but this happens everywhere, whether it's beds or pots. And in this example, we're talking about moms and pots. And so now this was probably the plant that prompted the desire to make a soil test. And once we've homogenized these variations in soil chemistry or soil balance or mineral quantity, we then get this other like averaged homogenized example. And so when we get the data from the soil test and we amend these 4 pots, this test like somewhat represents these 2 that are fairly similar, but it definitely doesn't represent this pot, and it definitely doesn't represent this pot. So this is where it can get fairly overwhelming in how to approach this, because, you know, if you've got 4 moms and 30-gallon pots, you're probably not going to sample all 4 pots individually. Early in my career of mineral balancing, there were some people that would send in a sample for each bed, and at that early stage, I was like, I don't know if this is really necessary. The longer I do this, the more I see that's very necessary. So, you know, the first cannabis grower that I worked with that really like just kind of demanded testing every single bed in the building was always running dank. And it always seemed like a lot of cost for a small scale grow. 100% of the time doing that math, you know, got that return on investment. So I now do that everywhere. So if we start to amend these pots, we're still going to have a problem with this plant. We might be over applying on this soil because it's not as depleted, and these 2 are probably going to continue to thrive because they, generally speaking, seem to be an average of the other 2, and we're going to continue fighting this problem. And so that's a real issue to manage. So let's take a different example. Let's now take the same 4 pots, but instead of homogenizing for a soil sample, we're going to add 4 more pots. And we lucked out in this situation because, again, we got a soil that was consistent, which is, again, is not very common, but it's from the same manufacturer. It has the same label. We ordered it from the same place. We picked it up at the same address. It's the same label. It's not the same soil. Even me, who goes through ridiculous lengths to have consistent soil, there's just naturally a variation in the soil blending process itself. Even on a pallet, you could see this much variation between 2 pallets of soil. And most people don't think of that, especially at the smallest scale. So, you know, I've seen people that got a pallet of soil, filled up 2 beds with it, and there was 100% variation in the mineral chemistry on those 2 beds, and you wouldn't normally think it. So let's say we're expanding our operation and we're now moving to 8 moms. We run several months, and again, we're having the same phenomenon. We've got some heavy feeders, we've got some lighter feeders. We're continuing to have the same phenomenons over here. This is starting to now affect clone production. We're now increasing the time it takes for roots to establish. We're now decreasing health of those clones because they're in the dome longer. We now have wider variations in rooting times, which leads to a not a lower percentage, but a lower quality of clone across all clones, because some have taken a long time to establish and some have been in the domes way too long. When we come into a facility and analyze track and trace data, which was, pretty grumbled by, pretty frustrated to be asked to do for most of the cannabis farms, and I agree, it was pretty obnoxious, and it was an added cost, and most farms had to hire an employee just to manage track and trace data. But we turned that data into a lot of analytical evaluation of a facility, and we could absolutely trace a 10, 20, 30, 40% decrease in overall output, either yields or potency or bag appeal or whatever. And when you trace that yield data, which is the easiest to quantify, back to mom health and clone health, there's a very clear connection between the quality of clones you produce and the yield that comes from that. And our main focus is quality, but it's just easiest to talk about yield because it's a little bit less subjective. So the importance of getting mom stock extremely healthy, getting clone quality exceptionally consistent, absolutely is 10, 20, 30, sometimes 40% yield. When we've come to a facility that's like very varied, extremely varied like this, that's having a bunch of small pots and tremendous variations in soil, when you correct this phenomenon, right off the top, a lot of times we double the yield of that facility, which is pretty easy to do. And that sounds like pure heresy to most people on the receiving end of this YouTube, but that's just the deal. It's pretty common that we actually double output. So if you come into this now mom space with 8 pots and you homogenize all this soil, what is this soil test going to represent? What are we going to learn about the needs of soil chemistry if we homogenize all 8 of these pots into one? What does that look like? And what benefit does that actually provide to us? And how are we going to approach this going into the future? This is pretty dynamic. One of the things I like to do in a situation like this is we use a lot of wristbands for the party supply store, and we'll put it around the stock of the plant. We started doing that back in like 2016, and it was the only way you could keep track of moms that were moving around a building. So you could do something as simple as blue soil, green soil, the date, whatever you want to do, but I think it's essential that once you start to get multiple versions of soil or multiple deliveries of soil, that you're able to identify what that soil is moving into the future. So little wristbands, little plant tags, mark the bag, something like that. You have to first, at minimum, in my opinion, at minimum, define and keep track of the generations of soil that you are using in your mom pots, because we have clients and farms that we interact with for well over a year, and they'll still add 2 or 3 mom pots and homogenize all the soil. It's just kind of something that everybody does naturally. It's understandable that we would do that. As farmers, we look at soil and we say soil is soil is soil is soil. And we bought the soil from so-and-so person and whatever store, and it's the same. It's never the same. Never, never, never the same. Not one single time have I made a soil batch that had identical numbers. There's similar trends, like my soil comes out at a certain quantity, comes out at a certain balance, sometimes better than others. And that's consistent across all brands. There's just inherent variation in the soil making process because it's such a large volume of material that you're dealing with, and a simple 10% here or there on the tractor operator or the conveyor belt can lead to pretty significant variations in soil. So at minimum, you need to identify batch 1 and batch 2 and try to homogenize those in some form or fashion that's actionable moving into the future. So I would even go so far as to group these into, blue group and green group. And even amongst blue and green group, it probably would be advisable to at least sample this one differently. So we've got some plants that are looking hungry. So a lot of times when variation presents itself, we will separate that variation. And you can drive yourself mad sampling every single pot and every single bed, and you're going to always find more variations. You have to try and find something that's fairly practical, but typically we'll start slicing up a batch of soil or a room or a group of beds or what have you based on performance. So after a couple rounds of moms, this one I guarantee is clearly showing visual symptoms of unhappiness. So I would at minimum pull this one out, and then if you homogenize these three, you'd be in better shape than homogenizing all four. So when variation starts to reveal itself, you want to isolate that variation or separate that into two different distinct groups, label them appropriately, and then start amending them, in my opinion, until they start to reveal each other and look the same. It's very common that we'll have wide variations in soil from bed to bed, and as we start to consistently, most importantly, consistently amend, quantify, amend, sample, etc., we can start to move those numbers to very exact to each other. I think that's the beauty of the Albrecht method, and why I use it is you can very clearly quantify the part per million nutrient quantity of a soil using like Logan or Spectrum or Kinsey Labs. And then you can calculate very accurately how much calcium is coming from your gypsum, and you can see where that target will move to. And as long as you follow the principles of keeping the soil volume straight and accurately assessing the amendments you're using and accurately dispensing the amendments you're using, the system that we've developed for managing soils can be extremely accurate. And we can take these four soils that are remarkably varied and start to turn them all back into a very consistent thing. And this is the process of living soil that other areas of agriculture don't really deal with. If you've got rock wool slabs from week to week to month to year, they don't vary that much. The only real variation we've seen with rock wool is during certain times of peak demand, we've seen heavy metals pop up here and there. So, you know, with rock wool, with cocoa coir, the cocoa coir pretty much stays the same from a mineral chemistry standpoint and doesn't vary wildly. It might vary in sodium content, but the general trend of the nutritional makeup and what that cocoa coir or what that rock wool slab or hydroton for that matter is contributing to the plant is very consistent and very similar. In a living soil system, you get a tremendous amount of advantages, and I would not trade it for the consistency of rock wool. You're not going to convince me to do that. But you have to manage this other thing. So we can cut cost to production significantly lower than any other hydroponic strategy. I've analyzed the feed recipes of some of the best hydroponic growers in the entire cannabis industry, and the cheapest I've seen was back in 2018, which was about 70 cents a square foot nutrient input cost. I calculated a similar size greenhouse recently using 2022 prices for our products, the Organics Alive stuff, the Soil Symbiotic stuff, and we came out to like 53 cents a square foot. So even after this peak shenanigans of whatever the heck's going on right now, from an inflationary period and a $7 diesel period, we're still, 20% less cost than the single lowest hydroponic cost I've ever heard in my entire life. And that was from literally one of the top growers on the entire planet that had some of the most advanced crew. So we get a tremendous advantage in living soil. We get significantly lower cost of production. We get significantly lower cost by not having to bring in your cocoa coir, your rock wool, your substrate every single time. We bring that expensive soil in one time and we maintain it. We rarely experience powdery mildew when the principles of the soil food web techniques, actual soil food web techniques, not Korean natural farming, not Vortex tea brewers, but like following the principles that Dr. Elaine set forth, using the quantification methods that she developed. When farms follow that, you can take PM completely off the table. So when you compare living soil to hydroponics, we rarely deal with powdery mildew. Usually in the onset, we make some slight changes. We might make a knockdown spray here or there. It is not a consistent problem in any of the gardens that we work with, or somebody like Nick Tomasini would work with. I believe he has extremely powdery mildew-free gardens as well and his clients. So we can take the labor and the effort and the cost for managing powdery mildew, and we can continue to invest it into our farm. You know, there's significant water savings. When we've done an analysis of a cocoa drain to waste type facility and swapped it straight out for living soil, kept all things equal, the living soil uses somewhere between 1/5 and 1/7 of the water of a typical cocoa drain to waste using a 10 to 15 gallon pot. That is substantial. That is a substantial savings, especially when most of the world is talking about drought. So there are advantage after advantage after advantage after advantage in living soil over every other technique. No disrespect, I don't care what you think is cool. Living soil is leading the entire cannabis industry right now. But you have to manage the soil, and you have to behave differently than you ever have before, because I'll admit, rock wool doesn't do this, but rock wool also has a lot of powdery mildew, so we're trying to do something different here. The other obstacle you have to manage is what the soil wants and what the soil needs and what we try to feed that soil. So according to the Albrecht method, we'll just say general textbook numbers. I'm not saying this applies to all contexts, but let's just take the most general textbook numbers of we're aiming for 68% calcium, 12% magnesium, and 4% potassium. That can range anywhere from 68 to 74 for calcium, anywhere from 10 to 15 for magnesium, and anywhere from 4 to 7 for potassium. But nonetheless, the important part is significantly more calcium than the other elements. Recently, I did an analysis of available garden products. There was an organization that was looking to provide organic inputs, so we did a pretty lengthy analysis of all the available products. And at best, you might find a mineral top dress product that contains about 10% calcium. It might have 4% magnesium and 7% potassium. It's my personal belief that these ratios are this way because the organics, or not organics, all products typically have to put that NPK number on the front. If you build a soil amendment product that has 68% calcium, you're diluting the nitrogen, you're diluting the magnesium, you're diluting the potassium, and you'd have to put 000 on there. And most gardeners are not going to buy an organic amendment that says 000. So I believe that's what's driven these like really wonky ass numbers on organic products, because organic farmers need to see like a 232, 247, 447, 555, 510.5. They got to see some shit like that. And so at best, you can find an off-the-shelf mineral top dress product that has 10% calcium. Most of them don't have any calcium in it at all. So when we take that mineral amendment top dress and we try to apply it to a soil that needs this type of balance, you start to get something like this, and you can stack it on. So now you're at 28, 14. Now you're at 30, 12, 21. Now you're at 40, 16, 28. This doesn't look anything like what the textbook and my personal experience is showing that the distribution of calcium, magnesium, potassium needs to be. And this is important because calcium and magnesium and potassium all play together on the soil colloid or the soil particle with different forces. And the calcium, from what I understand, tends to have a pushing away force. So calcium will do what they call flocculate. So calcium pushes away, and that spreads those soil particles out. And so instead of being like a stack of dimes, they start to be like a house of cards. And magnesium has a pulling in force. So it's this relationship between calcium and magnesium that's pushing and pulling on the microscopic little pieces of the smallest particles called clay that leads to porosity, that leads to space for roots to grow, that leads to space for water to infiltrate into the soil. And if you start to do top dressing like this, which I'm telling you mathematically, everybody is. It's not, I'm not trying to single out any one specific technique. It doesn't matter where you go. The numbers are doing this. Like it doesn't matter if you're like, Sarah's sister who's a home gardener or, the most respected Coots Tech farmer. This is what's happening. And the downstream consequence of this is, at minimum, you're ending up significantly deficient in calcium. You've got proportionally way too much magnesium. So now you start to run into a tight, constricted soil. When you start to have too much magnesium, in the case of cannabis, that's a yield and quality killer. I would imagine in produce it's the same. They're just not currently measuring that. But in cannabis, it's definitely a yield and a quality killer. So in this soil over here, we're now getting very tight, compacted soils. We're having poor infiltration of water. We might be completely eliminating the proper infiltration of oxygen into that soil. So now we're driving anaerobic conditions from we're driving anaerobic biological conditions from a function of chemistry and how the chemistry interplays with the components of soil. So, and then on top of that, we're supposed to have 4% potassium, and we're all the way up to 28% potassium. And in my personal experience, the reason why I say that the target here, I guess we'll jump to this, is the range for potassium, in my opinion, on the Logan Malick 3 test is between 4 and 7%. It is extremely easy for us to come to a facility, start implementing proper biological management, making tweaks to chemistry, and getting significant reductions in pest pressure, oftentimes almost entirely eliminating that pest pressure. Very easy to eliminate that powdery mildew pressure, but when potassium is over 7%, it gets harder for us to do that. So the textbook says 4% potassium. I try to keep it under 7% because that's where it's hard for me to keep a farm pest and mold free. And so this would be the distribution of a soil that's been receiving this whole business. And so if we keep stacking on CalMag and potassium like this using top dress products, numerically this is where we end up. So most cannabis soils that are following the popular trends, we don't need to name them specifically, I'm not trying to single anybody out, but most of the soils that come to me where they've been following popular trends with really standard mineral top dress, doesn't matter if it's Mr. B's or whatever, you end up mathematically here. The guy, Dr. Albrecht, that determined this in these books behind me, this white one, he shows some pictures of plants that are grown, and he made the assertion that when calcium is below 60%, most plants won't even grow properly. So when a cannabis farmer or a vegetable farmer or whatever comes to us and you've got 45% base saturation on calcium, plain and simple, all hell's breaking loose here. Proportionally, we have extremely tight soil. We have poor oxygen in the root zone. We've got a massive deficiency of calcium, and we've got way too much potassium. Potassium's an electrolyte. When it starts to get this imbalanced between calcium and potassium, that potassium goes into the plant easier than calcium, I guess you could say, and the plant now builds predominantly weak, watery cells. If I came to a farm with 29% potassium and 45% calcium, I could throw biology at this all day long and it will improve it. It'll improve growth rates. It'll minimize problems, but this is going to be a significant hurdle to overcome for a substantial amount of time. And I think you all would be shocked at the quantity of farms that are operating in this range of balance. And that's one of the main reasons why I've developed this class, because it's clear that what really needs to happen in all agricultural spaces is an increased awareness of how to manage soil chemistry, how to amend your soil properly, and how to avoid catastrophe from using really inappropriate top dress strategies, which, just mathematically speaking, everyone is. If you're using an off-the-shelf blended mineral top dress, you are creating this problem, I guarantee it. Mathematically, you're guaranteed. There's no way you're not. So the only real way to manage that, my personal preference, is not to use those blended products because they're not really suitable for any soil. You can get the yield from them. You can get some quality from them, but you're literally destroying soil. And the goal is to increase soil quality and to increase soil regeneration. And this is not regenerative. This is catastrophic crop loss, going out of business, repurchasing soil. And that's kind of the opposite of regenerative, or is the opposite. And so this is clipped off of the same set of soils from the saturated paste test. So on the saturated paste test, we're looking for similar concepts, but a little bit different targets. And you can see we're literally upside down. And so from a solubility standpoint, we're completely ass backwards. Furthermore, sodium's up to 11%, which is getting close to the quantity of calcium. This is a complete disaster. And this is actually quite common. And so when we continue to do this, and especially in the cannabis space, we're growing in these extremely dysfunctional soils, and everybody's like, yo, is this TMV? And I'm like, yo, what are we doing? Like, what are we actually doing? Like, everybody thinks they got TMV, and I'm like, yo, we got 45% base saturation of calcium. So my whole goal is to keep y'all off the sloth train. This whole virus thing in cannabis is just completely out of control. And from my viewpoint, it is the easiest thing to fix, y'all. We've been fixing cannabis viruses since 2016 pretty easily, pretty readily. And we're not doing it with any crazy techniques. I mean, it was crazy techniques back in the day, but now it's like standard fare that like our growers group members know. So I think it starts at minimum with soil chemistry. I think that's the easiest thing for people to reach, and I think it's by and large one of the biggest issues. There's a tremendous issue with biological matters in all agricultural spaces, but the biology thing can get a little bit complicated, and I think it's easier for people to get into the soil chemistry. So like I said, we got the soil balancing masterclass coming up. We've got another round. Each member has access to our calculator tools for a calendar year. We also have a private forum where everybody can convene. After the 8 sessions end, we all meet monthly for monthly meetings, which will now start next Friday. So, if you're interested in the soil balancing class, go ahead and jump online and submit an application and get your ass into the education. So that's all I got for the little presentation I had planned. So I'm going to give a couple minutes or a couple seconds here to let some questions develop. And in the meantime, we're going to say hello to the homies that are always here. What is up? Space Cat, Big Jars, Southern Other Gun Soil, always in here. We got some homie coming in from Neptune, which is kind of cool. Let's see here. So Della Cheese just finished the soil balancing class, and his backyard garden is ranging. I'm going to put this back up so you can see the homie's avatar. This homeboy was the veg manager of one of the biggest facilities in the entire state of California, and he is now crushing it in the backyard with the living soil. So that's what we do here. We take salt-based farmers and we turn them into real farmers that create real quality. So yeah, it will lead all, and it is happening. The food industry is a little bit slower behind in development. The one thing I really like about the cannabis industry and why I continue to engage so heavily is, for the most part, they're more open-minded. I do think they're a little bit easier to mind control, and they're a little bit too easy to fall for the greatest hype shit. I wish that would change. But by and large, very open and outside the box. I think that mostly came from the fact that people wouldn't answer us. So like we couldn't call up a lab and have them answer us. So we had to develop our own strategies, and we're so genetically predispositioned to not do the standard road. I think that's led to a lot of innovation. We're now starting to see that food farmers are getting pinched. A lot of the nutrients or salt-based fertilizers that are manufactured for agriculture are made in and around Russia and Ukraine or whatever's going on. I don't really know. I don't really keep up on too much politics, but nonetheless, fertilizers are many times more costly than organic-based products at this time. And we just did a local food farming event, and food farmers came up, and they're now hitting that pain point of where they're ready for a change. When you have the combination of extremely costly fertilizers or completely unavailable, and you go into a drought and you cut their water 10, 15, 20%, that farmer is now on the verge of going out of business. So the food farmers are now, I'd say 2019, 2020, 2021, especially 2022 right now, they're starting to listen. So that's why we need more people that can do soil balancing. The soils in agricultural landscapes are absolutely destroyed. Absolutely destroyed. And they're going to need some significant correcting. I'm not trying to do all that correcting. It is my goal, like I've said, in 2022 and 2023, to produce as many professionally trained soil balancing ass kickers as possible. And I give you a personal promise that I will do everything in my power to equip you to that. And we are seeing that in our classes. So the farmers that are going through these classes, some of those people are Soil Food Web advisors, some of those people are just agricultural consultants, but we are building a system and a method for managing soil chemistry that is very actionable, very accurate, and is clearly working. So I want to just keep stacking bodies in there that can do soil chemistry, and we can change the narrative of what is going on with what I would define as like really inappropriate management of soil chemistry, to be honest. So get your questions in the chat. I'll try to get through them here. It's a little bit more difficult when I'm by myself. But what would I recommend for someone that doesn't have a bioreactor? I would personally do just a worm bin. You don't need a tremendous amount of compost. The little 3 cubic foot Home Depot tote or standard Rubbermaid tote, 3 cubic feet is enough compost to make compost extract to, 30,000 square foot of pots. That's a shitload of compost. So you don't need hundreds of pounds of it. It can help, but most people can get by with just a worm bin. I think the real issue with worm bins is people try to put too much stuff in there. They try to keep piling stuff in there. And I personally believe that you should just build it once with the total volume that you're going to need, similar to how we would approach a bioreactor, and just put it all in there at once and just don't let it dry out. And then put worms in it and let it take time. Everybody wants their worm bin to pop off in 2 months, and that makes really crappy compost. So you have to be willing to allow the time for it to become actual quality compost. And then also you're going to want to inoculate. If you're in a suburban environment and you just start mixing ingredients together, you're not going to get biologically complete compost. You're just going to get other shit. And yeah, I would agree that cannabis is a very hungry plant, but it doesn't need, by any stretch of the imagination, 63% soluble calcium or 29% on the Malic 3. 7% is plenty. It's my argument that you need to do the yield production with calcium. Most people try to do it with nitrogen and potassium, and you can do it, but you're going to end up with significant problems. So, so here's a question about getting soil from a reputable source, and I do suggest that. I do believe this person is down in Mexico. I don't know if that even exists. They love chemicals in Mexico. That might be worth driving it across the border. I don't really know. If you are not in the United States, then you're going to have to make this compost yourself. We do have a master class for composting, or not we, Sarah does. Actually, it's, let me get it here. It's in the modules. So Sarah has 2 composting modules for composting. Obviously, this is for the Dr. Lane thermal composting, and this is for the bioreactor, but you can easily apply the principles to a worm bin. What's important is the choice of materials, how you approach those materials, and how you combine them together. That's what's actually important. So I would think if you did either one of those modules, you could still make really good worm compost, and then you put that in there. So, and yeah, David is going in on the Crescive compost. It's been working really well for him. He's a masterclass student that is guiding farms in the Mendocino area. got a ton of history, got a ton of experience, and a little bit of our tweaks to his old proven just solid principles kicking ass. So yeah. So right on. Hope you guys are enjoying all this. Yeah, and I don't know if you get Wi-Fi in Neptune, but yeah, we're available for the classes in the future. So, so let me know if y'all got some other questions. I'm going to give it just here a little bit longer and maybe wrap it up. But I know I've kind of hammered it home. We're doing the soil balancing class where we cover everything from managing large-scale agriculture to small pots, making your own soil, interpreting soil tests, using the calculator tool to come to the mathematical understandings. We also have the private forum where you can post your soil data logs, and we all as a group are learning together, which was our goal. Sarah and I have worked one-on-one very intensely with some of the best farms on the planet, some of the smallest farms on the planet, and a whole bunch of people you've never heard of. And it's now time for us to work in groups. And we're seeing tremendous benefit working with groups because of the accelerated learning. We're not abandoning our one-on-one consulting, but it's our personal fear that the environment is changing and the world is changing much faster than we can change it one-on-one through farms. And so we've made a radical shift in the last year to be able to be approachable to smaller farms, and pretty much everybody's in a financial pinch right now. So we're trying to distill down our consulting into more approachable forms. And I'm pretty proud of what we're doing with them. We're having some really good results, and the masterclass students, plain and simple, are whooping ass. And so, growing up, I played sports. As a young adult, I coached sports, and some of those players that I coached went on to set NCAA records and win championships and state championships. Next week, I'm going to an event that's honoring a team I coached in 2002 that won the Southern California CIF softball championship, and so that's pretty cool. And that's my favorite thing. And I love being able to contribute my experience to a talented individual that's driven and hungry, and watching that go. I'm only capable of so much by myself, and it's time for Sarah and I to now hit the numbers. We've been focusing on very intense outcomes and industry-leading results one-on-one very intimately, and now it's clear we need to work with 10 to 20 people at a time and get this shit rolling. So agriculture, I believe, is in a renaissance and going through a radical upward shift. And plain and simple, you either got to get with it or you're going to get left behind. And if you are new to living soil and you don't know how to manage mineral chemistry, you're going to go out of business. The profit is not in the product right now to afford to lose and get your ass kicked. And so, and to those of you that are in the industry and have history, if you don't get on it, you're going to get left behind, because most of these dudes in the chat are not longtime living soil people. They're accomplished, qualified cocoa growers. They're accomplished, qualified hydro growers that have learned to execute effectively in living soil, which is what I've done. And there's a radical movement of people coming from other techniques. And we're now starting to see a concern from living soil legacy growers of new people rushing in. And that's just kind of how the world works. And you're going to need to put the effort in to improve your abilities to continue moving upward, or plain and simple, you're going to get left behind. And the market's shrinking, and it is what it is. And it starts with mineral chemistry, it starts with managing biology, and it starts with managing your farm as a system. And that's what we're teaching in the master classes. So you get on it. And thanks for tuning in. I really enjoy doing this stuff. If I don't do a Science Bro, it's because I already did way too many hours of this Zoom calling in the day. But I really enjoy this stuff. We've been very quiet publicly because it just causes too much of a stir. And we've broken the internet a couple times. And at this point, I don't even care about breaking the internet. We are in a catastrophic climate crisis, whether you want to identify it as that or not. My analysis can tell you that's what's happening. And it's not about brands, it's not about business, it's about human survivability, it's about producing nutrient-dense food, and it's about producing actual medicine that's high quality in the cannabis space, and that's what we're driving. And so if you want to get on with that, get your butt in the masterclass. I guess I should mention there's a couple ways to pay for the masterclass. We can split it up. There's some other options. So I know everybody's in a pinch, but if you think maybe you can't afford it, send in the application and just open communication, and we'll try to work with people. So, and yeah, we're seeing the biological revolution all the world. Earlier today, I worked with a guy in Europe. I just wrapped up a class with 2 Soil Food Web advisors in Europe as well. We've got some clients in Trinidad. We've got some clients in South America. We've got some clients in Australia. We've got a whole thing popping off on the west coast of Canada. And that is moving at a very fast rate. So the biological revolution is happening everywhere because I think people realize that is, it's a human survivability issue from my point. So David King comes from the long era of throwing away soil. That was the deal, turn and burn. It's my belief that the turning and burning of the soil is what led to these really inappropriate, or at least contributed to these really imbalanced all-in-one top dress products. So if you're throwing away the soil, you just see the yield, the quality, and the minor pest pressure and think that's the way it is. If you try to take those top dress products and cram them in, usually all hell breaks loose somewhere between 3 and 5 harvests on a soil. And anybody that's got a bed in a greenhouse in any of these regions knows what I'm talking about. And it's just plain and simple, you will not, listen to me, you will not be able to be financially viable into the future of any agricultural enterprise if you are having to throw out your soil. It's just not going to happen. It just can't do it. We have dealt with every single kind of disease you could ever imagine, and none of them scare me. None of them are bad. We distill them down into simple terms. And most people want a specific analysis, like they want to know it's fusarium. They want to know it's blight. They want to know, and to me, I don't care what it is. I just look very simply. Is a bug eating the plant material, or is a mold digesting it? Is a bug eating at the roots, or is a pathogen digesting it? If you zoom back to like 1,000-foot view and just see what is happening, is a pathogen attacking the above ground biomass, or is a pathogen attacking the below ground biomass? If you can do that, it's a very simple correction. If you're having a pathogen in the root zone, then that would come about with too much nitrogen, too much potassium, not enough calcium. So low oxygen concentration in the soil. It can also come from improper management of biology, and I hate to say it, but pretty much everybody statistically is improperly managing biology. Sarah and I were racking our brains the other day trying to think of how many soil samples we've had since 2015 that came in from people we did not know that were very close to the desirable biological targets defined by Dr. Elaine Ingham that is further confirmed by our work. And I could think of 2 individual people, not even 2 farms, just like 2 individual samples came in and were like, hey, that's really nice biology. You're not very far off. Everybody else is completely off the map. It's plain and simple. All the airlift tea brewers, all the tea brew recipes, all that shit is remarkably prone to create disease. And so most people that are doing any biological management is making a hell of a mess. So if you have a southern blight, usually that's an agricultural issue. So I would say too much nitrogen, too much potassium, not enough calcium. You got to get that soil balanced. And then you have to outcompete the pathogen. And when you do that, all the problems become very simple. Most of the predator insect people, they get a little upset when I start simplifying it that much, but our work every day tells us that it is that simple. So if you understand the practices and principles of managing soil chemistry in appropriate fashion, and you try to produce yield with a combination of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and nitrogen, instead of trying to do it all with nitrogen and potassium. It's really easy to create root-borne pathogens with excessive nitrogen and excessive potassium. So here's an interesting question about how to deal with the potassium. I recently had somebody that dealt with too much nitrogen with a cover crop, which was a really interesting way to deal with it. They let the cover crop grow and then they removed the cover crop, and that radically dropped the nitrogen, which is a pretty smart strategy. Too much potassium is a little bit trickier. I would try to deal with it with time and then make the application to the soil that's appropriate that would bring calcium into relative balance with potassium. And if that's not possible, then you need to do it over time. And that's usually what happens in most of the gardens. We need to make multiple applications to bring that soil back into balance. But most important, you got to knock it off with the potassium. It's really common that we come into a farm that has similar mineral balance to what I showed with these really excessive nitrogen potassium levels, and then we make the correction, and then they still add more top dress product and muck it all up again. So I personally don't, the cover crop removing nitrogen was really clever and it worked. I still would approach it with math. I still would approach it with regular repeated doses of minerals and go from there. And yeah, Delacheesy's absolutely crushing it. The dude's got some plants that are twice the size of the backyard. Hopefully that doesn't make the neighbors too thirsty. So yeah, man, you do got to get that cooties away. Cooties are on the way. And yeah, Space Cat is a Soil Food Web graduate that went through the consultant training program that is now, after several years, getting her opportunity to be the leader of a regulated commercial facility. And that is pretty exciting. She just hand mixed a couple cubic yards of soil to get the moms going. And yeah, it was pretty close. It's extremely difficult to hit it on point. I think it's important to determine that my personal strategy isn't even necessarily to have an exact soil balance come off the assembly line, because I think it's fairly impractical. I think you can get close. I think you can be in desirable ranges. But my personal strategy is to produce the soil as accurately as possible and then still test it and fine tune it. That's personally what I do. So, right on. And I hope that helps. So, yeah, not to, beat it over the head one more time. If you've made it this far, you've already heard me say it 12 times, but soil balancing class is starting November 3rd. We're going to meet 8 times, not in a row. I like to leave a little bit of gap, so we'll meet 3 or 4 weeks. We'll take a week or 2 off. We'll jump around the holidays a little bit. We'll give people time to get a soil test, to get some analysis back so we can work on it. And we'll meet 8 times in about 12 or 13 weeks. And then all students will have access to the forum for a calendar year. And then all students will have access to the calculator tool for a calendar year. And all students will have access to my personal attention to their garden for a calendar year. So, yeah, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool to say. Yeah, well, you've been a good student, We try to produce the same information to most people, and you still have to be able to hear what we're saying. And so it takes both the information from the teacher and the aptitude and the drive and the desire from the student, and that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for people that want to be top 1% of the agricultural industry. I promise you we can put you there. That's what we do every day. And so if that's something that's interested to you, I'm not trying to alienate the home growers. Like, you can still be top of the industry at home by yourself, but I see there's also a need to produce qualified professional technicians to solve the problems of a rapidly and vigorously growing industry called living soil. So with that siren outside, I will say peace out. We'll meet you next week. Or actually, not weeks, 2 weeks. We're going to go do some family stuff. And like I said, they're putting the team I coached back in the day into the Hall of Fame, which is pretty dope. So I'm trying to put you into the Hall of Fame. So let's get it done, fam. Let's get it done.